Okay, well, welcome everyone. We'll get started. Thank you so much for joining this Finequity webinar on heuristic-based financial training with the Africa Gender Innovation Lab and Ideas 42. This is the second of a series of 3 webinars on design and action, looking at gender intelligent design. The first, you may recall, was in October with Developing World Markets and Women in Business Mozambique. And both of these webinars and our next webinar will highlight the Gender Intelligent Design Knowledge Guide that was created in partnership with Finequity and USAID that we'll be sharing the link to in the chat. Before I get started, a few small housekeeping requests. Please, if you have any questions for our speakers, add them to the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, and then we'll have about half an hour at the end of the session to respond to those questions and to engage with our speakers. I also invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you're representing or where you're dialing in from, and share your LinkedIn profile if you so please. This is going to be an hour long. As I mentioned, we will have our speakers first, and I'm delighted today to introduce a very fine set of speakers. We have, first we're going to have Manasi Desai and Louis Aye from Ideas 42. And they're going to be presenting on their approach to heuristics-based financial training, and also, for many of us, telling us what a heuristic really is and what this represents for financial literacy, financial inclusion rather, as an opportunity, which I think it holds great opportunity. We're then going to be hearing from Adiam Halamikal. And she's an economist with the Africa Gender Innovation Lab. And they have been working with Ideas 42 specifically in Ethiopia. And so we're going to be hearing about what they have found in their preliminary results, and what this looks like for the going forward. Some very interesting and surprising results, so I'm excited that we can dig into that. But without further ado, I will hand over to our speakers. Manasi, I think you're going to share your slides. And welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. I'm excited to speak with all of you today. I'm particularly excited to share this project, as it's a project that we started back in 2008 at the inception of Ideas 42, and have continued to refine and scale over time. Lois, just want to give her a chance to, perfect, share the slides.
Can you not see the slides?
We can. Yep. All right. To give you a bit of background on this particular project, Ideas 42 has focused, especially early on growth of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We know that SMEs make up over 90% of businesses worldwide and account for over 50% of the world's employment. They contribute to multiple countries' GDP and support communities throughout the developing world. So we know that they're sort of a vital component to the growth and development of many communities. And we know that business owners' jobs are often very difficult. And we know that they're sophisticated. They're managing multiple processes, finances, both within their business and within their home. And yet they often lack skills that they're needed to ensure that their businesses succeed and grow. So Ideas 42 really thought about solving this skills gap to help micro entrepreneurs improve their businesses, support their families, and positively impact their communities overall. Next slide. The problem that we came across, though, is when we looked at traditional trainings for these communities, is that we see many, many of these trainings sort of being put on around the world, but that often these are unsuccessful at changing key behaviors and outcomes. Meta-analyses have shown limited and modest impacts. Looking at just performance, there's been low attendance. Even in programs that are potentially effective on a small level, they're difficult to scale and are often reliant on a charismatic teacher or a particular curriculum that hasn't been duplicated elsewhere. Next slide. And behavioral science gives us some insight into why some of these trainings aren't really affecting people's outcomes. To start with, we often notice that concepts that are presented are unnecessarily complicated. In fact, they often are not really meeting the context that people are living within. For example, thinking about double entry accounting and compound interest is not necessarily helpful to someone having very quick sort of transactions day to day in their business without the aid of some sort of electronic support to help them keep track of these things. Even the advice that they're getting may not be top of mind at critical moments when people need it. And often financial education more generally can be condescending and undervalue what people already know, and often then leads to people feeling disengaged or talking down to. Next slide. Or click. And all of this sort of comes together to show us that increased knowledge does not necessarily equate to increased action, or the lessons that we're sort of giving people translating into their actual behaviors in business later on. And I think part of this also when we think about designing for women is a question about how we think about women and how we're sort of designing for women. Often we see that programs are designed around stereotypes about women, that they're risk averse, that they're maybe not confident enough, that they have different priorities or not aspirational. And using these sort of stereotypes and potentially incorrect assumptions really leads to programming and products that aren't necessarily speaking to the true needs that women are facing. And so using behavioral science, we often focus on what are the contexts that people are actually living in, and how do those affect how they're interacting with programs or taking them up. Next slide. So when we look at micro entrepreneurs and women in particular, we start to see a lot of their contexts come out through a set of interviews that we've done with entrepreneurs around the world. To start with, we know that women entrepreneurs are often in fast-paced, demanding businesses with many transactions happening at once. In addition to this sort of demanding work role, they often have disproportionate household and cognitive labor. They often have limited educational opportunities as well. And so thinking about often how financial education and business counseling training is offered, we see that women have a long day of work followed by a long set of household tasks around cleaning, taking care of children, cooking, et cetera. And after all of that, must travel to a classroom to learn complex concepts. And so we can imagine that anyone might be a little bit drained, a little bit exhausted, and maybe not in the most ideal position for learning new skills. And so the result of that is we often see is low engagement, low take-up, and for the reasons I already cited, little to no impact on behavior change. Now I'm going to pass it off to Lois to talk us through how Ideas 42 has thought about redesigning these trainings to make them more actionable and appropriate. Take it away, Lois.
Sure, thanks, Manasi. So in light of the issues that Manasi has just described, we can all agree that financial and business training programs are in need of innovation. We need a better approach to helping business owners learn the kinds of skills that they need to grow their businesses more successfully. Ideas 42 worked with some of our academic affiliates from Harvard University and MIT to design the financial heuristics training program, which provides simple, applicable lessons to small business owners for running their businesses and managing their finances. And the heuristics training focused on 4 main areas: cash separation, credit management, inventory management, and supplier management. Just to provide an overview of what a heuristic is, a heuristic is a broadly accurate guide or principle or a simple rule of thumb that is grounded in practice rather than theory. Heuristics are simple and easy to apply and are created for real-world contexts. And Ideas 42 developed the heuristics program based upon past research that shows that simplification approaches are effective at improving social outcomes along a variety of indicators, such as helping people take up retirement savings programs, helping people apply for student loans, helping people reduce weight, and there's a long list that goes on. Studies also show that financial heuristics are effective for specific reasons. The fact that they are simple make them easy to absorb and therefore remember. And they also cut through the noise in the sense that the way information is presented affects how it is received and processed. And if important information is surrounded by a lot of information that is less important or less actionable, people may struggle to identify and filter through what is the most useful takeaway for them. And that could make them struggle in application. So heuristics cuts through the noise and provides what is most useful and actionable, and then makes it easier for people to follow through. Also, when complex concepts are broken down into heuristics, it requires less time to apply, and that makes it less likely for people to procrastinate and increases follow through, again, because they don't have to spend a lot of time translating the knowledge they have gotten into what it means for action. For our financial heuristics training program, one example of a heuristic that we provided was helping business owners understand the importance of separating business accounts from household accounts. And this is important for multiple reasons. It helps firms to gauge their profitability and sustainability. It also acts as a commitment device to mitigate the risk of business owners dipping into business finances for household needs and thereby eating into their working capital. And as you can see, it's very simple. In the example provided here, keep two separate drawers, business and household. So it's simple and easy to remember. It's also, it matches the context of the entrepreneurs where they're actually using drawers to store their money. They're working in a fast-paced context. They're not going to have time to actually write down records. And so this matches how they actually operate. We tested the heuristics training program first in the Dominican Republic between 2006 and 2008. Using a randomized control trial where we randomly provided some business owners with the heuristics training in a classroom-based setting, and then randomly provided other business owners with standardized accounting training, standard accounting training, and then some people received no training at all. And we found that people who received the heuristics training had improved business practices, and had also improved their business outcomes like revenues and sales, which was very exciting. And seeing the impact that we had in the Dominican Republic, we wanted to expand this to more places and more people to maximize the impact. But it's quite challenging to do that in a classroom-based setting. It's quite expensive. It takes significant time for both implementers and participants. And it's also challenging to standardize the content and the delivery of the content across different trainers who might have different styles, different levels of charisma and things like that. And so we explored a digital approach where we maintained the heuristic-based curriculum, but then we used interactive voice response services or IVR services to deliver pre-recorded messages to business owners over the phone. And we tested this in the Philippines, India, and most recently in Ethiopia. And in all of these different countries and regions, we have seen consistently positive results when it comes to improvements in business practices and engagement rates. In Ethiopia, the analysis of the randomized control trial is still ongoing. The World Bank handled where the external evaluators for the project, and Adiam is going to share a bit more about some of their early findings. Just to get a bit more specific about how we optimized this as we went along, we improved the training in two main ways. Firstly, the curriculum, and then also the delivery channel. So when it comes to the curriculum, as I mentioned before, we use a heuristics-based approach. We expanded the curriculum a little bit as we moved along different countries to cover different topics. We also, based upon feedback that we received from some of the earlier countries we worked in, shortened the lessons to be a lot more concise, and we kept them to 3 to 4 minutes. I think in Ethiopia, we had a few 5-minute lessons. that were sent by phone weekly at the entrepreneur's convenience. So the entrepreneur were given the opportunity to state a time where they were going to be less distracted and more likely to engage, and then the messages were delivered at that time. We also employed an engaging narrative style. So we told the heuristics were delivered as in a storytelling format from the perspective of a fellow business owner who was just sharing her life experiences, the challenges that she had faced, and some of the tips she had learned along the way, which made it easier for people to relate to and learn from. And then we also use local examples where possible. In terms of the delivery channels, the IVR channel allowed us to reach entrepreneurs no matter where they were. It was also accessible to people who may have had low literacy levels because it was delivered, by voice. We also utilized professional voice actors. This was also based upon feedback we had gotten about the fact that they needed people who sounded like them and who sounded more colloquially familiar. And so we used professional voice actors who could do this. And then we introduced a callback feature for business owners to call back if they missed the lessons or if they just wanted to refresh themselves on some of the lessons that they had listened to earlier in the week. And as we replicated from place to place, we focused on trying to understand what were the common needs across these different places and what features needed to be changed and adapted to suit the local context. We also were focused on trying to understand what the local resource constraints were for delivering the message. So for example, what partnership models existed that we could leverage and what technology capacity existed that we could leverage for delivering the trainings. And just to bring it home a little bit more, I'll hone in a bit more on the work we did in Ethiopia and demonstrate how we kind of adapted the curriculum for the context. So in Ethiopia, we began with a preliminary proof of concept before we launched a larger scale intervention, which was delivered through a randomized control trial. For the preliminary proof of concept, we had three main things that we did. Contextual reconnaissance, curriculum refinement, and user testing. For contextual reconnaissance, we were focused on understanding if there were consistent skills gaps within the context. So basically, we wanted to know if the kinds of skills gaps we had seen in the past countries we had worked in were similar or the same in Ethiopia. And this was particularly important to us in Ethiopia because we had found that the population of business owners we were working with were quite different from other countries. They, on average, had bigger business sizes in terms of the number of employees they had and the sizes of loans that they were having access to. They were also, on average, older and had higher education levels. So we weren't sure if the curriculum would be relevant to them or if some of the concepts would be a bit too simple for them. But we were happy to find that a lot of the gaps in skills were still relevant, and we, through qualitative interviews with business owners as well as literature reviews, were able to identify that a lot of the challenges that business owners face in the other countries that we have worked in were still relevant here. Beyond just understanding if the skills gaps were the same, we also wanted to understand what the business norms and practices were within the Ethiopian context to ensure that the way that we were framing and delivering the content would be relevant. Based upon what we found during contextual reconnaissance, we then refined the curriculum to reflect the learnings and to reflect the local cultural practices and business norms that we had learned about. We also adapted the partnership model to the context. So in the past countries we had worked in, we had partnered with a microfinance institution or microfinance institutions to deliver the trainings. And we felt that some of the success we saw in engagement might have been due to the fact that it was linked to the MFI that was providing loans for the business owner. So we weren't sure if we needed that to also see high engagement rates in Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, we could not leverage an MFI relationship. We worked with the World Bank on a World Bank funded project called the Women's Entrepreneurship Development Project, where female entrepreneurs were provided with business and financial support, but not necessarily solely loans. And so we weren't sure if that would have an effect on take-up and engagement. But through the preliminary proof of concept work, we saw that even in spite of this, take-up was still quite high and engagement was still really high. After these steps, we then conducted a small-scale user testing where we recorded a sample of the training narratives and delivered them using an IVR platform to, first of all, test how this would work, get some preliminary stats on actual engagement rates. And then also we conducted interviews with the recipients to understand how the experience was for them and if they felt like this was useful and relevant and meaningful. And based upon what we found, we launched a larger scale randomized control trial, which the analysis of which is still ongoing, but then you're going to be hearing a bit about the early results from ADIAM. So even though the impact evaluation results are still being analyzed, we did see some positive preliminary results in terms of engagement. The engagement rates in Ethiopia are the highest we've seen in all the countries we've worked in, and we got very good feedback also from participants about the relevance and applicability of this to their work. And we are finding
Thank you so much, Lewis. We need to move on to our next speaker, but we will have a chance to come back.
Sure, sounds good.
Thank you so much. Adiam, do you want to talk us through the approach in Ethiopia and what the initial findings said?
Good.
Thank you.
I'm having the same problem I had earlier.
And yeah, if you go.
Yeah. Does it look okay now?
Yes, it looks
Okay,
great.
perfect. Thanks so much, Kathy and Finiquity, for having us today. My name is Adiam Hagos Haile Mikel. I'm an economist working with the Africa Region Gender Innovation Lab. I'm going to be presenting to you some of the very early preliminary results that we have from an impact evaluation study we did to evaluate the heuristic financial training program in Ethiopia. This is work I'm doing with my colleague Guruma Baba. And just to emphasize that these are very early results, and there is going to be some refinement that we're going to have to do on this work. Okay, on to my presentation. So as Manasseh mentioned earlier, self-employment is quite important for women. But there are a lot of constraints that prevail. In Africa, more than half of the women in an agricultural labor force are engaged in self-employment. However, the women-owned firms that are engaged in female-dominated sectors are earning much lower returns from the sectors that they are engaged in than they would have gained from participating in male-dominated sectors. And also there are a multitude of challenges that women-owned or women and entrepreneurs face. There are substantial challenges in accessing credit, in accessing inputs. There are social norms related challenges, and there are also regulatory challenges that they face. If just to give you an example, even in Ethiopia, if you look at financial inclusion, there has been an increase in the gender gap from around 8.5 in 2015 to around 16% in 2019. Just to give you a sense of the kind of challenges that women are facing, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but also particularly in Ethiopia. There have been several types of training programs tested, provided to women entrepreneurs, tested in different contexts. There are there are studies finding quite mixed results, especially on the effectiveness of traditional classroom-based training programs. Manasseh has gone through the kind of challenges related to these types of programs, so I won't be going to that in detail, but want to highlight that the evidence is quite mixed. And there is quite the meta-analysis is showing that there are issues related to context specificity, the nature of the content designed, and also the quality of the trainers, the training providers. However, there is also emerging evidence showing that there are some promising types of training programs, including mindset-oriented training programs, heuristics-based training programs, and so forth. For this particular study, we're going to be focusing on the heuristics training program that has been tested by IDEAS 42, that has been designed by IDEAS 42 in Ethiopia. Particularly, we test the heuristics-based financial lessons delivered through a mobile phone-based interactive voice response platform. So, like Manasseh mentioned earlier, like Lois and Manasseh mentioned earlier, the two innovations with this intervention is that, one, we are providing simplified, easy to recall and understand type of lessons. On the other hand, also to make the lessons accessible and address time and mobility constraints for women, these are delivered via phone instead of having to bring the women together in a classroom. This work is part of the Innovations and Financing for Women Entrepreneurs project, which is part of the Africa Region Gender Innovation Lab, and tastes a portfolio of innovative interventions on business development services and also financial products that aim to address the gender gap in access to these two dimensions. And this is both the study and also all of the interventions or the pilots are financed by Global Affairs Canada. With regards to the study design, our focus is one on, we want to look at the difference in take-up this time around. How does take-up vary when you deliver these interventions, these simple and easy to recall interventions, and also how does take-up vary when you deliver it through an accessible mobile-based platform. And also we also want to focus on outcomes. First layer of outcomes are changes in financial behavior. This includes financial practices, inventory management, and credit management, all of which are directly related to the intervention, to the lessons delivered through IDEAS 42. And also we want to look at the downstream effects of firm performance, which includes profits, business size, and sales. We follow a randomized control trial method where we randomize our sample of 6,000 women into 4 groups. The first 2 groups are treatment groups, where half of them are assigned to the IVR only group, and the other half are assigned to IVR plus SMS. The SMS component is, these are reminder messages with summary of the lessons. They sent after the IVR lessons are provided for 21 weeks. So these are 10 reminder messages delivered on a weekly basis, just to see whether there is a difference in impact if you nudge or if you remind the women to apply the lessons. On the control group, we have 2 groups, one pure control and another group, just to see if there are Hawthorne effects related to the intervention. You know, if we're inducing with the women to respond in a certain kind of way, just by calling them on a weekly basis. Now, just to give you a background on the survey, the sampling frame comes from a registry of women in the World Bank funded Women Entrepreneurs Development Project. The baseline survey was conducted between February and April of 2021, and the follow-up survey was conducted 7 to 8 months after the completion of the intervention between June and August 2022. We have also managed to gain detailed call log and admin data through the Viamo platform. Viamo was the one who was dispatching the calls to the entrepreneurs. We partnered with Viamo to deliver the lessons. Our estimation method, basically by comparing our treatment and control groups, we try to measure the estimates to measure the impact, which is basically what the ANCOVA does. We also have tried to adapt machine learning methods, to identify which kind of covariates to control. We also test for heterogeneity for impact by looking at different subgroups by marital status, initial level of financial practices at baseline, business size, access to credit, and those types of variables. So now on to take up. Overall, take up is quite decent. 2/3 of the women in our sample in the treatment group have completed 14 out of 21 lessons, which is the indicator we used for training completion. And this is quite high compared to other business training programs. Just to give you a sense, personal initiative training program tested in Ethiopia had only 41% take up, and other traditional and mindset-oriented training programs had 50%. So it shows you that there is almost a third of an increase in percentage gain through this delivery platform. Or also. Yeah, and the average lesson completion rate was 70%, while pickup rate was around 84%. 97% of the women have completed at least one lesson. We also tried to identify whether there were some predictors of take-up, and we saw that education, literacy, and access to loans and business size matter for take-up. With regards to the very preliminary results that we've found on primary outcomes, we find that business practice scores, which are directly related to the lessons delivered through the training, particularly on cash separation, on calculating profit, we find a 24% increase in the financial practice scores in the IVR group, and a 13% increase in the financial practice scores in the IVR plus SMS group. We also look at inventory management score, which has components of lessons on inventory management. We check whether they are applying those lessons, and we find a 13.4 increase in inventory management score in the IVR group. We have also looked at credit management. We haven't seen much change on this score. And we also have a wider set of indicators, which include part of the lessons that are delivered through this training program, but have additional dimensions, just to make sure we have comparable scores with other studies. And we do not see much change on these outcomes. With regards to secondary outcomes, we look at saving, although we don't see much change on the intensive margin of saving. We do see an increase in the probability of saving. We do not see any changes on business performance outcomes such as profit, sales, and business size. However, we also look at subgroup effects, and we have noticed that the impact is concentrated among single women, both for the primary outcomes and for the secondary outcomes. We also look some variation based on education and also the size of businesses. Before I conclude, I just want to walk you through, just to show you that there is still a lot of work that we want to do in relation to this study. We want to examine impact on business survival because we've noticed that the other pilots that are part of the IFWE program have, even if they don't show change on the baseline, on the bottom line indicators such as profits and sales, they do show changes in business survival. So we want to dig deeper in that, particularly because this intervention was delivered around the time of COVID. We also want to explore the impact on intermediate variables such as investment and borrowing. We are still working on that. We want to understand the mechanisms to impact. We also want to, because there are so many estimations we're making, we also want to conduct multiple hypothesis tests just to make sure that we're just not, mining the data and looking for statistically significant effects. We also want to conduct, we also plan to conduct a cost effectiveness analysis and assess potential for scale up. And lastly, we also are planning we also have plans to conduct a long-term follow-up. Also, we'll need to be looking for funding for that. With this, I conclude my presentation. And if you have any questions, please put them forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adiam, and I can confirm that we have lots of questions. So very engaged chat. Thanks everyone for putting your questions in the meeting chat. Please continue to do so. I have a question for you, Adiam, from Ekaterina Diakonova. How do you explain that the results are better for IVR than for IVR and SMS? It's an unusual, I saw that as well and was perplexed when I first saw it.
Yeah, one of the surprising results that we found that we have still not managed to unpack, but there are two. So we suspect two things, right? One is we are probably annoying them because we've delivered 21 phone messages, and then we sent additional 10 messages, and which might have forced them to disengage from the license. Something you would have to unpack. The second is we also want to look at the messages again, just to make sure that there is no contradictory or message content that might have been misunderstood. So that's actually one of the things that we plan to do as we dig deeper into our results. That we also, just to say that we also found that that result a bit striking.
Yeah, I'll say we've done some work around message testing in the past, and have tried things where we increase the frequency and duration, and have found that to some extent increasing frequency of messages increases engagement, and then at a certain point it drops off. And so though we haven't had a lot of time to talk with Adiam and Guillaume about these results, I think this is something that sort of mimics what we've seen in other contexts where there may be like a, sort of an upper limit to how much you message people and how much they're engaging with it.
That's really interesting. And a question for Lois, or Manasi, as you please, but thinking about ideas, the four contexts that the training was carried out in over the years, do you have a sense of what's driving different impacts in these different contexts?
So I think something worth noting is the period after which the training was implemented when it was evaluated. So in the Dominican Republic, we actually had a midline survey and an endline survey. So midline survey was sort of a few months after, and endline survey was a year afterward. And in that one, they actually found that they saw a change in behavior in the short term, but didn't see a change in business outcomes until the longer term. In India and the Philippines, we just, by the nature of our grant, were only able to look at it 3 months after. And so though we saw the behavior change, we weren't able to capture the business outcomes. And it sort of makes sense if you think about how the trainings affect business outcomes, as well as sort of in India and the Philippines. In India in particular, it happened during demonetization, which I think we're happy we saw any change, given how kind of chaotic it was, both for treatment and control, but generally that it was sort of a very unique economic circumstance when this was happening. And then in Ethiopia, I think we also see just more engagement, more take up. And so, kind of excited to dive into these results. I think we see more impact also there. And, I think it would be helpful to unpack that. I think what's interesting is we didn't necessarily expect as much impact in Ethiopia, given that the average business owner had higher education levels, that their businesses were larger. And so it was, to Lois's earlier points, it was really important for us to check early on if these skill gaps actually existed and whether we really thought this was going to meet that need. And, also whether not having a financial service provider as the partner would affect take up. And it was just exciting to see there is still this gap. There is, not exciting that there's a gap, but, exciting to see we're still able to speak to the needs of this population despite different characteristics that they hold and despite not having the sort of pressure of a financial service provider there potentially driving engagement.
And just to add, I think this is something that we would continue to explore as we hopefully test this in other contexts, because it's not, the impacts are not always in the direction that you'd assume. Beyond, so like Manasi mentioned, the demonetization in India affected how people actually transacted, and that affected the results that we saw there. But in Ethiopia, beyond just the business owners having different characteristics, the wider climate was very different. During the intervention, there was some political turbulence. It was in the middle of COVID-19. And as a result of that, it affected even the technology capacity, the capacity of the tech provider, which was a local tech provider, to deliver the messages at the right times. And we expected it to actually have a negative effect on outcomes, but we are seeing actually higher effects. So I think there's still a lot to unpack as we move from place to place and understand what exactly is driving some of these things.
So, I think that lots of people will be looking at these different, interventions and thinking that seems like a great idea. And there's some comments in the chat sort of asking about training materials and whatnot. But I think the key thing with heuristics is really they are just so incredibly context specific. And looking across, the four contexts that you worked in over this period, what would you say to someone who was thinking, I'd like to do that. I'm going to not copy and paste. I wouldn't presume that people would copy and paste, but I'm going to replicate that. The beauty of heuristics as well is that they tend to rebalance the burden of responsibility around time from the implementer to the person using it, or to the implementer rather, where all of this work has to be done on the back end for it to actually save time for the person up front. What advice would you give to partners who are thinking about this and thinking about it in the context of their own work and not wanting to necessarily, copy and paste anything, but also seeing opportunity?
Yeah, I think it speaks to some of the slides that Lois shared earlier, where, I think with any replication, you want to do some sort of preliminary groundwork to identify first off, is this training actually speaking to a need that you see on the ground, right? Were these gaps actually present, which is an important thing to check in any context, right? So really understanding, does the content speak to a need that we have? And so I think what's cool about heuristics is that I think the lessons we've seen across countries and contexts are relatively uniform in terms of what skills we're trying to provide. But where we think actually the tailoring is really important is in not just translating the curriculum to a local language, but using local vocabulary and business norms to help guide how you talk about the lessons and even tweak the lessons. And using I think a lot of the sort of value of it is that it's engaging and relatable. And from a behavioral perspective, we know that's important in getting people to listen and feel that it applies to their work and consider it applying to their work. So I think, if someone's thinking about doing this, we're happy to talk about ways to sort of do some preliminary work to help, check the applicability of the studies, identify where the lessons, identify where there may be deviations. For example, in the Philippines, they had different credit management practices that we saw in other countries, and so you'd want to tweak them there. And then how to make it just kind of engaging and useful to people, and sort of delivered at a moment when works for them. And so I think the training is meant to be flexible to allow women to identify like moments when they have quiet and have like the ability to really digest and hear things. But to even just check those assumptions, right? Like, do those moments exist? Are there places where they can hear them? Do you have, I think Lois talked about this as well, like, we worked with different IVR providers in different countries, and that had limitations in terms of how we were able to scale, and how, I think we worked well with Viama to figure out a solution in the end to get this sort of happening at scale, but it was sort of a unique program. So really doing some piloting around how the thing is delivered before you introduce it at scale is, I think, really critical as well. I don't know if Lois has other thoughts.
Yeah, I think also just understanding like habits around phone use and not making assumptions around that, depending on the population you're focusing on. We did a different study in Ghana recently where we were trying to do a phone-based approach to engaging people in an urban city in Accra. We're trying to focus on adolescent girls, and we found that even though it's an urban city and people use phones, like it wasn't going to be the right platform because the kind of access that girls had to phones were very restricted, and things like that. I think, and it's easy to make assumptions based upon just, it's an urban city, it's developed, it should be fine. But some time is needed to understand what are the phone practices. And we did, try to explore that. If people actually, pick up phones when they see a number that's a bit different from the usual number they get, and things like that. And just to give an example of the kinds of changes that we made, we got feedback on like things that seem trivial, like in giving examples of things people could sell in their shops, people would say things like, oh, like if you gave me an example of certain kinds of tin tomatoes, like that's like too expensive. I wouldn't sell that, and therefore like that feels very like irrelevant to me, and that could make me actually disengage, like this is not for me. So even simple things like the kinds of examples that you're providing like should be tested to make sure that, and there's always going to be variation, but then for the largest number of people, you hope to find relevance.
Thank you so much. Now we've got absolutely loads of questions in here that I'm trying to get through. So a few more questions for each of you, but if you could keep your responses to a couple of minutes, that would be great. Adiam, there's a question from Walid Ahmed in here asking about training sensitization and how that was done with the women entrepreneurs. At the outset, how was this managed?
Okay. So after the baseline survey was conducted before the rollout of the training program, the enumerators who did the baseline survey went back, contacted the women, and did a short. So they called. This was done via phone, and they did a short introduction session, just to walk them through what to expect, when to expect the calls, what type of contact to expect, just to give them a heads up for all the women that were in the treatment group. So in other settings, I think in India and in Philippines, the women were invited by the MFI to come and attend an orientation session. We didn't have that in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, it was just done via phone. And just to add to what Lois, I'm just making use of the opportunity, just to add to what Lois had earlier mentioned, there was fear that because there is no finance MFI to piggyback on, that take-up would be low. We looked at the take-up data, and women who had access to WEDEP loan actually didn't involve in the training as much as the women that didn't receive a WEDEP loan. It's despite the fact that the women who had a WEDEP loan didn't want to engage as much, that we still managed to get this level of take-up, just to give you a sense of how effective the delivery platform and also the reception to the content of the training was.
Thanks, Adiam. And one more question for you. I have a really in-depth question here from Danielle Hopkins about personal initiative training and how that, might or might not be incorporated into the IVR training, specifically in light of the fact that there is limited follow-up opportunity. Was that something that, I'd love to hear Ariam's thoughts on that, and then perhaps Manasi and Lewis, you could expand on it, sort of the inclusion of personal initiative training and, thinking about that alongside or instead of business training.
So the financial heuristics training program, as to my understanding, didn't have any personal initiative components. We have tasted other training programs in Ethiopia, in other country settings, in Mozambique, Togo. We have tasted the personal initiative training program, but in this particular intervention, there was no personal initiative content.
Yeah,
and I guess in terms of the opportunity for follow-up, perhaps that's something that you could mention, how sort of post-training support worked to boost confidence after the business training, because it's I don't think that there are any plans following this.
I mean, I would honestly question, not to question those trainings, but question the premise that the big gap is confidence as much as other. I mean, we know that these women are running complicated businesses and handling lots of different responsibilities, and certainly have initiative in their day-to-day work. I mean, I think it's the reason, I think that's part of the reason we don't necessarily have sort of elements of that in the training. And I think it's something we're trying to think through more generally as we think about our gender-based work, is that, certainly I think people point to things like confidence or, self-initiative and stuff like that as gaps. But I think we try to focus less on attributes of the people and more attributes of the context within which they're living to think about our designs. And so not to knock that training, but just to say that I think that we took a different approach in terms of thinking about how to design around this.
And
yeah.
Oh, sorry, Lois, you.
Sorry, just to quickly add, also we were not, I think, we were focused more on seeing how and whether the existing curriculum we had was going to be relevant for Ethiopia, and developing completely new content would involve a lot more effort and resources, and that was just not the mandate of this particular project. We have seen, and then just to piggyback on Manasi, that we also like to make sure that when we do these things, even if there's some research, that we can still get some evidence through qualitative research that this is a gap. And we just didn't find that from our qualitative work in Ethiopia. We have seen in other countries sometimes where it comes up that affirmation is important to helping people take up or help people feel comfortable with how we deliver other interventions. And even in those cases, the way we deliver it is really important. We saw in some contexts, for example, in Tanzania, that when we tried to be more direct with affirmation interventions, women actually felt very uncomfortable because in their culture, it was very wrong to kind of promote yourself. And so even the way that it's delivered and the way that it's done has to be done carefully, using a lot of tweaking and adaptation, and that was just not part of our mandate for this intervention.
Thank you. And from Sheila Semfumo of Consumers International, a question around channels, post-training channels for feedback, and what that, perhaps what that has looked like in different contexts, if at all, for our Ideas 42 folks, and I guess also within the context of Ethiopia. So how can people, when you had that feedback, that sounded more like an evaluation than feedback on that they were then able to offer in real time?
Yeah, I think we having done RCTs for many years, often look at results and think this is very interesting, but I can't describe why this is happening. So I think we did try to do a bit of qualitative follow-up post-training to get at some of this feedback. And so I think, we sort of, as we think about continuing to refine and develop and scale this training program, would use a combination of qualitative feedback and, just looking at the results and seeing like which results are actually, or rather which lessons are actually resulting in behavior change. So I think we incorporate feedback, as Lois described, throughout the process. So early on to identify whether we see the same challenges on the ground, early on as we like develop the scripts for the heuristics, and then, in a very small pilot, as well as, after we deliver the training at scale. So I think we try our best to really like have a channel for identifying challenges throughout that process. And I think that really helps us think about how to continue to scale these things in the future.
Excellent. And a final question for Ideas 42, maybe Adiam, from Adele Atkinson. How closely aligned are the heuristics to the financial practice questions that you asked to measure progress? Are you specifically testing what you're training? I don't know who wants to pick this up.
I feel like Adiam is most familiar with that, but I would suspect yes. So I'll let her go.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the three indicators, credit, financial practices, credit management, and inventory management scores, the items of the scores are directly mapped to the lessons that were delivered through the training program. So those three indicators are quite closely aligned with the lessons of the intervention. We did have a wider score, a business practice score, that covered not just the lessons that were provided through the training, but also additional measures of business practice that have been also documented by other studies. So just to say that on those, from the three indicators that we use, 2 of them we've seen significant impact. But on the credit management score, in the business practice score, which, as I said, is wider in context in coverage than the lessons provided, we haven't documented any impacts.
Excellent. Listen, thank you very much to our 3 panelists, Adiam Haile Michal, Manasi Desai, and Louis Ai. Really, you've done a fantastic job of detailing this project. We're going to share these slides and this recording for anyone who would like to see it after the fact, and we'll keep note of any questions that we haven't been able to answer during this webinar, and hopefully beg some more responses from our panelists. But there'll be a small questionnaire at the end of this, which we'd love you to fill out. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again to our fantastic panelists. Have a great day or afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.